Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Immergence Show. Today's guest is someone who's been building the future since before most people had a name for it. James was one of the original contributors to the 2007 Metaverse Roadmap, a paper that predicted everything from digital ownership to decentralized economies long before Web3 was even a term. Since then, he's helped launch MMO studios, advised some of the earliest blockchain gaming projects, and pioneered ways to bring tokenization into culture, hospitality, and infrastructure. Today, we are digging into why gamification, the missing UX layer in Web3 and ownership platform, and how fans are becoming investors in the culture they love, and what it takes to build systems that are engaging, equitable, and built to last. As always, drop your questions in the chat. We will be pulling the best ones into the conversation. Tag your friends, and let's get into it. Hi, James. Thank you so much for being with us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks, Nico. It's great to see you again. Good morning, I guess, good afternoon and good evening to everybody who's, tuning in from around the world. It's nice to be here.
Awesome. We're so glad to have you. Why don't we start with a little bit of your backstory, personal, professional journey up until today?
Sure. Well, how long have we got? I guess there's only an hour, but I'll try and keep it shorter than that. So the story actually really begins when I was about 6 years old, which was in the mid-70s. And I got an Atari video game console for Christmas. And so since then, I've always been very enamored and enthralled with digital entertainment, particularly interactive digital entertainment. But I won't give you the year by year since I was 6. But the kind of key pieces were when I went to university, I did a philosophy degree, and it was all about computational model of the mind, which is basically looking at the human brain. And back then in the sort of mid to late 80s, it was all sort of theoretical as to whether or not machines would ever be able to emulate, the functionality of the human brain. You may have heard of the Turing test. So we spent a lot of time thinking about Turing tests and things like that. Since then, I guess that's kind of the reason why the video games industry has always been so enthralling for me. Over time, particularly as I sort of ended up getting into massively multiplayer online gaming, which was the first part of my real career in games back in Asia. The whole idea of shared digital space, the whole idea of kind of like bringing some of the fiction that had come out around that sort of, mid-90s, like Snow Crash and things like this, to life was always the sort of common denominator. To sort of complete the story there, I ended up moving to Japan in 1993 after I graduated. And that was really initially, I thought I was going to go for a year or two, wanted to learn Japanese, wanted to carry on sort of studying what I'd been studying. But one thing led to another, led to a couple of kids, led to some jobs, initially actually in language teaching. So I was working with Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and the whole kind of language acquisition and the way that humans use language, or language is the defining factor. That was a key piece of the degree. And then through that ended up, sidestepping into this role with Nexon, which at the time was headquartered in Japan. And so I ended up, initially actually teaching the CEO English every morning, but quite quickly, he said, either I'm a terrible teacher or whatever, but why don't you go and do the international business development? I'd always sort of been, kind of like a social guy, I suppose. And so the idea of going to the Game Developers Conference in 2003, when the entire industry still fit in the bar at the San Jose Fairmont, was very appealing. Yeah, so I decided to do that and kind of learn what I needed to know about, particularly online game infrastructure at the time. The focus was really on servers and customer support and identity and all these kinds of things, like the nuts and bolts of the industry. So I came over to GDC 2003, met a bunch of guys, as I said, in the bar at the San Jose Fairmont, and many of those folks are still part of my network today. And so then since then, the career's sort of been split between infrastructure and technology on the one hand and content on the other. As you mentioned, the Metaverse Roadmap, that was sort of 2007, I think. And it was quite inspiring, really. A bunch of guys from the industry And again, particularly the online games industry, massively multiplayer online games industry, got together and wrote this metaverse roadmap white paper. And in that, we identified 6 pillars of the future, which we'll come on to later. But anyway, since then, yeah, half infrastructure and technology. Certainly in the early days, it was mainly things like hosting online games and things like that. And through Online Game Services, which was the US subsidiary that we started of the Japanese company, I ended up meeting my co-founders at a company called Roadhouse Interactive, which was a initially browser game studio, but quickly morphed into a mobile game studio. And we started that, I think, 2009, ended up moving to Vancouver in 2010. And so I've been here ever since. So Roadhouse had a great 6-year run, about 180 people at its peak. And we made games with Red Bull, Games Workshop on Warhammer. We did some stuff with Fox around Family Guy. And then for me, sort of personal career highlight was the opportunity to work with Iron Maiden on Legacy of the Beast as their mobile game. First time a major artist had toured a video game as opposed to an album, which was sort of very cool for me, having been a lifelong Maiden fan. And then 2016, we restructured Roadhouse, and since then, Greenstone has come into play. And at certain points in time, I have multiple, kind of consulting customers for the advisory. Certain points in time, one of those engagements will kind of pull out ahead, and maybe I'll go a little bit more full time. But yeah, so for the last 10 years, really, I've been focused on a multitude of things, but with that common denominator of, the 6 pillars of the future that we identified in the metaverse roadmap. So it's kind of cool now to sort of feel like we are kind of living in the future. And actually, having done a series of new blogs about the metaverse roadmap recently, kind of metaverse roadmap revisited, it's actually been really great, and that it's kind of reconnected me with some of the co-authors of that project, and we're sort of now looking at it saying, maybe we should try again and do another version that tries to predict 2040. But everybody sort of feels the same way. It was great to be part of that little group and have been thinking about this stuff for so long, and really now see it manifest. Here we are in Q1, Q2 2025.
Wow, you're a true futurist. A lot of people call themselves futurists, but you have actually done it, which is impressive.
Yeah, I don't know. There's always that challenge around being a little bit too early sometimes, But yeah, for sure. And it's always been that sort of fascination of the new, but also this blend of technology with entertainment and all these kinds of things that I think when you look at what's been going on recently, there's definitely a lot of roots in what we wrote back in 2007, and obviously before that, right? We were standing on the shoulder of giants, not only from a fiction perspective, but there was a lot of great seminal literature that came out around that time, and obviously earlier than that. But yeah, I mean, I have a talk that I give where we show, I think, the first person shooter on the Dragon 16. I think it was called Phantom Lord, maybe, or something like that. I forget now. But when you look at that and you see the progress that's been made in 40 years, it's just incredible, right?
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. I can't wait until the end of the show where we talk about, the future from now and hear your predictions. But let's get into other aspects. Before that, I want to thank our amazing engaged audience. Hi, Ian, Jean, Simone, Simon, and anyone else who's tuning in. Please drop a comment in the chat so we know you're here. And put in your questions, tag your friends, as Ian just already did. And hi, Emmy. Very excited that you all are here. We're so excited about this topic. I know a lot of my community members are into Web3 and gaming, so they're very excited to hear your perspective. And Yemi mentioned, when you create your own career from passion and consistency. Well done, James. Awesome.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's funny because when you look back, it seemed as though there was a plan. Rather than just doing the next thing that interested me. But actually, I guess the end result's the same. So I appreciate that sentiment. Thank you.
Steve Jobs says, looking back, we can connect the dots. Yeah. Awesome. So you mentioned the Iron Maiden game that you did. And, I'm curious kind of like how did that kind of help you think through the culture, community, and monetization? And just overall, like from all these experiences you shared, what are some of the aha moments or learnings that then led to where you are now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I mean, obviously, I remember the sort of early days of sort of getting in touch or actually being contacted by folks that knew the band were looking to do a new mobile game. I think the interesting thing about Maiden is they've always been quite innovative. You know, they had, the Ed Hunter game, I think sort of mid to late 90s, and have always sort of tried to push the envelope in various ways. And so when we got a phone call from a friend of a friend saying, hey, we think Maiden's looking for a mobile game developer, would you be interested? Of course, I was like, oh my God, but then, tried to try and stay cool on the phone initially. But yeah, so we ended up kind of, going to meet at the time, relatively new management within the organization. And I think one of the important things about working with Maiden is that you can't really just go in and say, okay, I think the game has to be like this, right? It has to be, and we knew it needed to be a collaborative thing because in order for it to be genuinely Maiden, they would obviously want to have a fair influence on that. And I guess, the important thing to kind of say about Maiden is that for a lot of folks, I'm not sure how many people know the depth of the story and the IP and the character Eddie and all of the stuff that's kind of been built up around, the albums as concept albums, all these kinds of things. So there is a very deep lore, a very sort of deep set of stories and a deep sort of a sort of number of common themes that you can find across Maiden albums, Maiden performances, characters, all these kinds of things, right? And so we knew that was going to be part of it, and we also knew that it was going to need to be, an authentic game, because again, everything the band does sort of has to come from that position of authenticity. But beyond that, we didn't really know what it was when we went to first have the conversation. So it was more about, the track record of the team at Roadhouse and sort of, everybody's, or I suppose specifically my understanding of what Maiden is and was and all these kinds of things. And so it was a collaborative process. And I think it was interesting to sort of see how everybody was willing and everybody was trying to figure out how we could blend these two different, music and interactive, or, further on in the career, I suppose back to Family Guy, TV and interactive. And so we've always, I guess, had this interest in taking these different forms of entertainment, at least initially, and then figuring out how they could blend together. And I think the interesting sort of things that come to my mind at the moment now is obviously back in 2013, 14, when we started to really figure some of this stuff out. The idea of having an expansion of the number of Eddie characters and all these kinds of things, the band and the management was very willing to go with that. And I think over time, that has been an interesting impact on the band as well, right? You can certainly see influences from the game in some of the later, work that the band's done, even aside from the game, stage set, some of the video stuff that's been starting to come in, things like this. And, I actually wonder quite a lot about what would have happened if we'd have been able to do that game where you had the sense of collectible Eddie characters and some of the other pieces, and what would have happened if it had been, 5 years later and blockchain NFTs, which unfortunately have become a little bit of a sullied word in music and entertainment at the moment, because I think some of the stuff that we did earlier in blockchain didn't really, lend itself very well to great reception from other forms of entertainment. But that aside, it's interesting to think about how much we could have done if the game could have been an even more integral piece of the fan experience for those periods of years while the Legacy of the Beast tour was happening. So does that, sorry, I sort of waffled there a little bit. I can't remember what the original question was, to be honest. Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh,
there we go.
So I appreciate you sharing that, comprehensive story. So let's talk about, how gaming has been kind of the test bed for the other technologies, like, even UX, economy design, and user retention. What do you think about this, about like how gaming has been ahead of the curve in terms of tech adoption? And, like even with metaverse,
yeah, I mean, I think it always has been. Sorry, you're just jumping there a little bit.
Oh, sorry. I was saying that, what do you think about gaming, continues to be leading the tech adoption. Even what we have in the metaverse comes from years of development in the gaming space. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I would agree with that 100%. And I've always sort of been an apologist for the games industry actually shaping that role. After Roadhouse, I spent a couple of years, having run a studio with 180 people. I decided to kind of go, partly starting Greenstone as a small advisory. But one of the things I did 2016-17 was to be the executive director of DGBC, which is the Industry Association for Games, Animation, Visual Effects here in British Columbia, Canada. And, part of that role actually was talking to government very specifically about how games have always been kind of a pioneer of innovation in general. I'll come on to the UX UI specific question in a second, but I think in general, I mean, in the earlier days, less so, but now when you think about why would people upgrade devices, why would people need better computers, why would this ongoing sort of adoption of technology happen? Games is probably the pillar, at least the socially acceptable pillar, as to why people constantly want to upgrade, because they want these better experiences. You want faster bandwidth. What are we doing at the moment, for example, figuring out cloud game streaming as servers become more and more affordable, all of these things that we've experimented with. And I think usually first in gaming, so I can think back to, well, for example, the dawn of free-to-play games, right? I think, if you think back to 2004, 2005, when, a game like Kart Rider really started to take off, particularly in Asia, there was a lot of vitriolic reaction, not only from the games industry, but more broadly around free-to-play business models, right? But now I think it's really hard to think almost of any online service. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's, a dating app or whether it's wellness or sleep applications, or all these kinds of things. They all have this sense of gamification, and they all, I think, learned a lot from this whole idea of attraction, retention, engagement, monetization. And so all of these things that we've sort of been experimenting with in the games industry, because I think not only the developers and the industry has this appetite for the new, but gamers in general are willing to be early adopters. And so it's been a recurring theme. So to go back to DigiBC for a second, we had a very specific white paper which plotted how many healthcare companies, architectural companies, metaverse companies had actually just been born, even only looking at Electronic Arts in Canada. So for those of you who don't know, EA has a really big studio locally in Burnaby, British Columbia, which in a way has sort of always been this anchor tenant of the province. And a lot of game studios have been born out of that, as people come and go in and out of Electronic Arts. But not only game studios, but certainly, metaverse companies, Finger Food Studios being a great example, which eventually got acquired by Unity. They were doing some amazing work, and the skill set and the adoption of the engine and the way that people think, and this sort of blending of technology with, a consumer-based experience, I think is really why everybody in the games industry should be very proud to be in the games industry, because, a lot of us go on to do these other things. And so, our message to government, even back in 2016, was without a really healthy and thriving video game sector, you're going to struggle to have a sort of healthy and thriving innovation sector in general. And actually in January, I was sort of on a panel at the DMCC in Dubai talking about the exact same thing. And so I think sometimes people get a little bit myopic saying, oh, we're building a games cluster, we're building a games cluster. But that isn't really the point. It's about building an innovation cluster in general. I will stick to that point forever, actually, because I still even think now, when you think about 2025 and the real sort of advances in technological innovation, I think it's broader than it used to be, but I still think, the games industry is the catalyst for a lot of the innovation that happens more broadly across society.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And we do have a few questions about the ownership, so I want to kind of transition into that conversation. We have seen this idea of tokenization and ownership coming with Web3. Has this existed in the gaming space, or is this something new? And what have you seen now working based on what gaming companies have been doing, or like blockchain gaming? What are your thoughts on that side?
Yeah, again, it's a very interesting question, and we could sort of talk about it for hours. But I think, the key points that I want to sort of address today are there are a few things, right? Number one, I think, there is this concept that certainly in Western markets, we had a bit of a false start, or at least we did bad PR around the first wave of blockchain NFTs and, some of the other components of sort of Web3. I think the first example I kind of want to give you is, a couple of years ago, actually last year, I think, I did, relatively extensive consulting gig with a company from South Korea called WeMade on their WeMix platform. And what's interesting about that is that the adoption of blockchain and ownership concepts within those games, so, like Mir and Night Crows being great examples, it wasn't quite the same approach where I think in Western markets, we sort of all got enthralled with, oh, you can play to earn, you play this game, you can become a millionaire. We're going to have, little sort of groups of folks like grinding for us and all this kind of stuff. And I think that might have been a little bit of a false start, but certainly when you look at a different approach, which I think is the one that, WeMade took, is to say, okay, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was a player behavior, a sort of inbuilt player behavior. And if you think about WoW or Unreal or, any of the other EverQuest and all these kinds of things, there was already this inbuilt player behavior where people wanted to invest in characters. They wanted to feel like they owned them. And when they couldn't, there was a couple of things happen, right? Number one, you would always end up with folks trying to sell their accounts, trying to sell their characters, frequently getting ripped off on the gray market. Not a great experience for the player, not a great experience for the company. And so I think, what happened when, particularly with some of the, more the better approaches to Web3 gaming that I've seen, they basically using blockchain to legitimize or formalize that player behavior. And so as a result of that, you end up only potentially introducing the blockchain components later game after somebody's into the game. And obviously, Korean grindy MMOs are kind of the perfect game format for this, I suppose. But nonetheless, what happened then was, the impact on long-term retention, the impact on, players feeling as though that they were actually invested in this game really sort of increased significantly. And so then gradually, I think some of the more esoteric Web3 components like staking and some of the other stuff that, you can do in Web3 get introduced gradually through this sort of format of the game. And I think that's a great way to do it, right? So in terms of things like player ownership, though, I guess that's a very game-specific answer. And then the other piece that obviously is happening at the moment is that assets themselves, obviously, there's this big sort of trend towards real-world asset tokenization, everything from, real estate obviously being a key one now. There's a lot of companies out there saying, hey, you can invest in real estate for as little as $100. Or, fine art. I mean, Masterworks, I guess, is the big daddy in the fine art space, where instead of having one person owning a $30 million Monet or whatever, you would end up with 30,000 people owning what, 10,000, $1,000, probably the math. Anyway, this whole idea of fractional ownership of assets is now coming into play, right? And I think things like music publishing, things like game development, things like film slates, production slates, all of these kinds of things are now coming into the mix. So how do these two things start to blend where, there's a sense of gamification, there is a sense of ownership, and I think they're all related to each other. And, to go back to the whole, games leads the way piece, I have a little talk that I sometimes do called Blockchain Gaming is going to Save the World. And the reason why I say that is not necessarily because I think blockchain gaming is going to do it, but I do think gaming, as always, is the thin end of the wedge where people start to create a wallet. They start to understand these concepts of, DeFi, decentralized ownership. And then the last thing I'll talk about, which I think is really important in all of this context, it kind of brings it together, and in many ways is sort of the common denominator for one of the projects that I'm working on, is this idea of turning fan, and it could be a game fan, music fan, doesn't matter. So fan to super fan has been part of the dialogue for a long time. And I think in the games industry, it was always, average player versus the somewhat pejorative term whale, right? How do you sort of have this sense of fan to super fan? And I think what's going on at the moment is we have this next phase that's becoming possible, and I call it owner champion. So I think fan to super fan to owner champion is a really interesting idea. And again, maybe it goes back to this whole concept of, with Maiden and the game, right? How do you turn people so that they genuinely own assets? Maybe some of those assets are income generating. If you could be an owner champion of a football club in the UK, which is an example that Republic and INX did recently, how much more invested in the success of that business or that operation are you going to be, right? And the answer is a lot, or at least the statistics show that the answer is going to be a lot. And so I think that is going to start coming through a lot more into various things that we're working on. And so to me, that's a really key piece. Now, some of that could be gaming, right? And I think gaming becomes a piece of that concept of owner champion. Are we at the point yet where we're fractionalizing the development of, let's say, the next, Company of Heroes title, for example? I don't know. I think it's right around the corner when you see people starting to fractionalize ownership of movie production slates and things like this. And I'll give you one last example. So last year, I was very fortunate to work for Aether for a period of time. So I'm not sure who's familiar with Aether, but Aether did a really amazing job, I think. And it's part of what I describe as the second wave of Web3. And with Aether, I think what happened there was that, this idea of taking something like AWS or Google Cloud or whatever, and decentralizing cloud computing so that instead of having a sort of single monolithic owner, within the Aether context, you've got somewhere north of 100,000 node owners, I think roughly, 5 million token holders or something like that. So this concept of owner champion comes back into play because not only do you get better, faster, cheaper GPU distributed hosting, which unlocks things like cloud gaming. So that's the sort of normie side of it. What you also see, I think, is as new games come out and you say, okay, hey, this new game here is going to be hosted, or this new AI tool is going to be hosted by all of you guys as the owner champions, you start to see this kind of network effect where people who have a vested interest in the success of those products, because they are genuinely invested in the success of the network on which they're being supported. It's a new kind of, I think, very blockchain. It's sort of the promise of blockchain in this egalitarian ownership structure, which allows a much more sort of, egalitarian relationship between I guess shareholders to a certain degree, because that's what everybody is. But then it all ties together into this virtuous cycle. So, yeah, I think all of it's going to sort of, as we move forward over the next 10, 20 years, I think there'll be a lot more folks with a lot more investments, sort of micro investments in things that generate passive income. And that will be a better society in which we all live.
Thank you so much. Very comprehensive and so many examples. And we do have several questions and comments on this topic.
Yeah, some interesting ones coming in. Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Justin said, not needed in the game industry. Most of what's being done in Web3 space can be done without blockchain. And he also added that what CCP are doing with Eve Frontier is actually interesting and innovative. What are your thoughts on what Justin mentioned?
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you actually need blockchain, right? Do you need smart contract? And I think to a certain degree, the jury's still out. I think in a lot of cases, though, I was, one of the things I did in the past few years was ran a Canadian small cap public company for a period of time. And so if you approach it from the other angle and you say, okay, well, let's assume that you have 100,000 shareholders or whatever, depending on the level of compliance that you need. And I understand that's maybe why the point is that you don't really need compliance in the game space. It's a real pain in the ass to have to do, corporate compliance and send out circulars to even 100,000 people, right? So if you start thinking about having 2-3 million owner champions in your ecosystem, and then you start to say, actually, these things genuinely are securities because we're starting to make money from these investments. I still think the jury's out as to whether that is security or utility. But nonetheless, for a second, let's just assume that there is this massive network of people, whether it's through a game or whether it's through some metaverse experience, whether it's through some sort of, tokenized membership organization around your favorite bands. I think the actual management of these kinds of things is far easier when you get onto blockchain than it is off blockchain. Now, obviously, that's not the same as talking about tokenization in crypto. It's talking about smart contracts. And then I think the next piece that's sort of becoming apparent if you read books like Jeff Booth, Price of Tomorrow, great book, some of the other Bitcoin maximalists who sort of fully believe that the entirety of this sort of Web3 activity is going to revert back to Bitcoin as the kind of true store of value. The connection between smart contract and value is also really important. So do you absolutely need stuff like that in the video games industry? I don't know. But in a sense, given that games has always been that sort of true catalyst of innovation, if games is the entry point through which people start to learn about, wallets on a simple level, start to learn about staking at another, start to learn about other sort of components in DeFi, which then ultimately transfer across into other areas of society, then I still think it's better for all of us. And I think gaming, as a result of that, games has done everybody a service, right? And naturally, why not to a certain degree, right? I don't see that there's any harm in implementing things on chain, particularly with more modern technologies where we're not paying massive gas fees and we don't sort of, we're not bogged down by the limitations of the technology anymore. Yeah.
I think one concern I've heard is that a lot of gamers think that metaverse people or Web3 people are claiming that a lot of the good that gaming has created are recent and these people have created. So that's a little bit of like conflict that I've heard. But we do have another comment from Yemi. The initial focus for the NFT space didn't really put ownership and utility as the focus of the projects, which I feel created the distrust in the mind of the public because there was no utility built into these digital assets. And then JK added that when utility did become focus, so many failed to deliver and rugged and perfect storm. So yeah, what are your thoughts? Anything you would like to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I kind of agree with that. I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily say that there wasn't utility and sorry, what was the other word? Utility and function, I guess. I just don't think that we ever did a really good job of explaining what that was. And then equally, yes, the whole concept of rug pulls and people having very vacuous business plans that raise millions of dollars on the promise of a token, and let's raise the token now and we'll figure out what to do with it later. But I mean, again, I have to say, being old, you have the benefit of hindsight, and to me, it just reminds me of the .com bubble or any other bubble that happened. And obviously, people pull out the tulip bubble that happened. I think it was in the 19th century, where people were speculating on tulip futures. So I don't think that that's actually. It's not peculiar to this latest round of technology advancements that we've had. I mean, obviously, the scale is potentially larger, I suppose, or the amount of hype was potentially larger because of the ways in which we could use, Discord and Telegram and all these social media channels in order to amplify what was going on. And so as a result of that, I think winners were larger, losers were bigger. And yeah, but, I mean, there's many companies, throughout history that have sort of managed to raise a huge amount of money on very little aside from a promise, right? And then to a certain degree, I think that actually now in this second phase, and again, speaking very highly of Aether, if you go look at the Aether dashboard, the transparency that's there is amazing, right? You can see the number of, GPU hours, you can see the amount of supply, you can see the amount of demand. And, to a very great degree, now that we're into this phase of utility and function, the token price should be a relatively accurate reflection of the value of the business, in the same way that a stock price should be a relatively accurate reflection of the value of that business over time, right? And again, you go look at the Canadian Securities Exchange or any of the other small cap markets, there's always a pump at the beginning. It always goes down. And then the winners are the ones that figure out how to actually plug in the real business value as it, grows into being NVIDIA or whatever it turns out to be, right? So, I don't see that there's that much difference. And actually, even in the early days, when you looked at JPEGs of monkeys, if you'd ever been to the Bored Ape Yacht Club and you'd kind of seen really how they were doing that was to sort of say, okay, we want to create this kind of members club, almost like an American Express Centurion card, and the perks and the benefits of the apes were there. And, there was that one case where that guy licensed the apes to turn it into a fast food restaurant and stuff like that. I think there was a lot of false starts, but I still think even in the early days of NFTs, it was actually just a bad PR job more than it was, in many cases, people having the rug pulls. Now, again, it's up to the user to decide. One of my favorite NFTs, and if anybody's on Telegram with me, I have an Avenged Sevenfold Deathbat NFT, and I'm quite pleased with the Avenged Sevenfold Deathbat NFT. Unfortunately, I didn't get one of the ones that gives me free shows for life. And, but obviously, there is underlying value in those Deathbat NFTs when it comes to sort of the relationship with the band. Obviously, if Avenged Sevenfold decides to stop touring, then the value of the free shows for life NFT is going to go down. So, is it a question of us finding our feet? Yes. Do I think that there are many, many, many projects at the moment that are genuinely doing special stuff with real underlying value that people can own? Yes, I also think that as well, right? So I think here we are in the sort of renaissance. We're not even renaissance. Second phase of Web3. Maybe it's Web4. The irony is that everybody's calling it Web 2.5 now, right? Or Web3 enabled, because we've got scared of the Web3 label, I think, because of all of these negative connotations. So when somebody says, "Oh, I'm Web3 enabled," I think what they mean is we're using all of the best bits of Web3, but we haven't forgotten what it means to be a real business, right? So.
Yeah, interesting perspective. And you mentioned earlier that there's no harm of using blockchain into gaming, and Justin has a counterpoint. What about the cost and environmental impact?
Yeah, I think people are working on that. I mean, obviously, the gas fees, the amount of compute that we need, they are concerns. But equally, I think that there has been a lot of work done to offset those problems. Even if you look at things like Liquid and Lightning now, RGB, and what I said earlier about the functionality of smart contracts coming back to Bitcoin. But I think, if you're looking at renewable energy, they said it's definitely it's an interesting debate, right? If you read, I think probably Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis talk about, the emergence of new battery technology in the next 10 to 20 years, which will mean that the, concerns around energy consumption will be drastically negated, right? So maybe we're living in this current period where, yes, we have to think about it. But if you are if you're from the school of abundance, figuring out that energy component will happen within the time that we need it to get figured out. Now, I'm not going to take a position on that either way, but I will also say things like, if you look at a lot of new data centers, we're doing things like capturing the heat in order to heat the next door buildings. There's a lot of people who are very smart thinking how to make servers that are 16 times less energy efficient. And I think, the existence of some of the more modern chains, which are less energy intensive, is also making a big, impact on all of this stuff. So yeah, I think it's, I think the boat sailed to a certain degree on, like, if you look at AI, was it Sam Altman was saying that please and thank you? I don't know how much of that was hyperbolic and how much please and thank you is actually costing open.
Yeah, I heard that too, that tweet that he had, but yeah.
Yeah. I still think it's worth saying please and thank you, just in case the AI overlords take over and sort of subject us all. And I'd like to be in the guy that was polite camp rather than the rude guy. So I don't know. It's a difficult one,
Cool. Thank you. And just quickly, I want to read the other comments and then we move on to the next topic. Yemi mentioned, I think blockchain will provide the traceability and validate ownership, hopefully help you rebuild trust through transparency and decentralized governance. JK mentioned, I believe in gaming specifically, wonderful for non-fungibility collections and trading, gated access with current owner verification, evolving ERC with characters, etc., and further chains and layers potentials with AI. We'll see on-chain gaming assets as being a major market and a win-win for semi-pros and the properties themselves.
Well, there's a lot in there. I mean, let's go in reverse order. I think the semi-pro thing is interesting, and I also actually think that these advantages are going to kind of even go further down the pipe, right? I mean, seeing a lot of companies at the moment, or I wouldn't say a lot, but there's a noticeable number of companies that are now trying to figure out kind of the little league of esports, or allowing or enabling people to sort of create their own home tournaments, and actually benefit from that. Right now, is that wagering? Are you saying that you're going to have 11-year-old players kind of wagering against each other? I'm not sure that that's really necessarily the outcome of that. But if you're going to do that activity anyway, and you are, able to kind of, I don't know, take an active role in this sort of development, I think that speaks back to this whole idea of having, 1 million user-generated content creators all making $100 rather than 100 guys making $1 million each, right? Which again, I find very compatible with the more egalitarian nature of blockchain as it moves forward. So I think even with games and things like that, that's a really good point. I think one of the key points that probably was that the first, first traceability and validate ownership. Yeah. So I think one of the other really interesting kind of meta trends at the moment is this move towards utilizing blockchain to put the ownership of data, and the term I think usually is self-sovereign data. So if you think about the last 20, 30 years, we've all been we've had our data kind of stolen from us. It's been sent around here. It's gone from this company to that company. We've all sort of ticked, terms of service agreements that have let people, kind of abuse us really from a data perspective. And I think one of the things that's happening at the moment is that there's a lot of very, very clever people working on how to restore the ownership of that data back into the hands of the individual, right? So, if you sort of think to yourself, okay, the example that I always use is, imagine going along to an online casino. How much data about you do they really need to know, right? Number one, they need to know you're old enough to gamble. And they don't need to know your age. They only need to know that you are old enough, right? Number two, they need to know that you're sitting somewhere where online gaming is legal. And number three, they need to know either you've got credit or you can afford to pay to play, right? So those are the only 3 data points they need. And so I think the example here is, if I'm then willing to share my, gender, if I'm willing to share my economic status, if I'm willing to share my physical location where I'm sitting, if I'm willing to share. So if I'm willing to share these things, then there should be a more equitable relationship between company and individual who's willing to share, right? So, a lot of guys that I see at the moment are working on how does that happen, in that I am the custodian of my data. I kind of lease out these pieces as I go around. And at any point in time, actually, I can renege permission and say, okay, that data belongs to me. You just had kind of a porthole that allowed you to access it. And you either paid me for it or I got some kind of perk or benefit. But today I've decided I'm going to shut off that access and I don't want those perks anymore. And again, I think, if you think about games and the sort of the interaction between player, company, how much we were willing to do that, I still sort of have this sense that a lot of that innovation will come through in gaming. Probably not as a core component of the game, but more around the sort of side components of community, building stuff up. And again, I think it comes back to this sort of overall concept of blockchain really kind of engendering this more egalitarian and equitable future at its heart, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And one more comment from Justin. There's also the risk of being tied to be a single chain, and the implications of that might mean to the business if it's reliant on it. What if something goes wrong with it, and where the company has to be reliant on a third-party service for their uptime?
Right. It's a great question, and it's certainly the answer. I sort of think I know it, but it's one of those answers that's probably beyond my technical capabilities to answer it. I can tell you where I think my sense is, and excuse me if I get the jargon wrong, but there's been a lot of work around things like EVM compatibility and cross-chain interoperability and all these kinds of things. I think that a lot of that is designed to say that, okay, if a certain chain goes down, what will happen? And I think actually that's why some of the more exclusive chains that don't have that EVM compatibility are starting to maybe, I would not necessarily suffer, but I think if you were making a choice as to a chain on which chain you were going to build a game on in 2025, you probably would not pick an exclusive chain that wasn't EVM compatible for that reason. I think thinking back to Amazon just shutting down, I can't remember which exactly it was, a couple of years ago. There were a lot of games that went down because Amazon decided arbitrarily to shut down a particular piece of its tech stack. I think it might have been Game Forward. No, I can't remember. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So, I mean, I think the risks of that have always been there. So I don't think that they're exacerbated by being on chain or being in Web3. And I would say that the likelihood of actually suffering that kind of catastrophic failure is far reduced actually within this more modern world than it was back when we were all sort of forced to be on centralized central servers. And then I also will say that I do know, and this is where it really goes beyond my capability to understand from a technical perspective, I do know some very, very smart people who are working on fully decentralized components of the tech stack, right? So I'll try and articulate this, but IPFS as a file storage system is supposed to be very sort of decentralized. But my understanding is even with IPFS, you still have a central key, right? You can still log into it. You can still, in a sense, get onto the decentralized network and figure out how to mess around with it. Whereas I think at the moment, this whole idea of completely zero knowledge, trustless node operators who are working on things which genuinely have no individual owner, you can sense that that is happening at the moment. And to a certain degree, again, I'll use Aether as another example. The whole idea of having 100,000 node checkers and, compute that's in data centers and this sort of the whole idea of deep in and decentralized network. It's really hard actually once it reaches a certain scale. I mean, I suppose like in a way like Bitcoin itself, where it doesn't make any sense to try and hack it now because the volume is so large that you might as well be legit. And I think you'll see that with a lot of deep in networks where it really is the whole idea of figuring out how to take it down becomes increasingly difficult over time as you get more and more, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of owner champions or, users who have invested in that. And the whole idea of it taking on its own sort of life outside of the realm of a centralized owner is really interesting. And I think, Sebastian from the Sandbox was recently commenting that ultimately the goal of any Web3 CEO should be able to make themselves completely redundant because the DAO comes in, the DAO makes these decisions. And so I do see that happening potentially in a few years' time. So I don't know, in a sense, it's almost like businesses couldn't be reliant on any single point of failure. And so therefore, the redundancy is kind of inevitably going to get built into the system even more robustly than it is today.
Thank you so much. And I want to transition to this topic of Bitcoin that you've been touching on. And we do have a question from Felipe. How do you think the smart contracts on Bitcoin will change the trajectory of gaming and Web3?
Well, I mean, personally, I think that the transition of smart contracts back to Bitcoin will change the trajectory of the world. Never mind gaming and Web3. But again, I think gaming Web3 potentially is where it starts to happen. I think I really will recommend, I can't recommend more highly reading The Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth. It's quite a controversial book, but the basic premise here is that Bitcoin, when it first came out, to speak back to that energy question, Bitcoin was great as a store of value. And depending on who you believe, in the long run, it may be the store of value as the world switches to Bitcoin as its reserve currency, right? So, one of my friends, Samson Mao, he's active in a company called Jan3, helping nations to transition from the US dollar onto Bitcoin, things like this. So there's a broader kind of macroeconomic piece here where if you believe that we should all be pegged to a currency which has a limited supply, incontrovertibly limited supply, right? So the reason why Bitcoin's interesting is there will only ever be 21 million, right? 21 million Bitcoins. And as a result of that, it is inherently deflationary as a currency. You can't just have the US federal government print another $20 trillion, which is great if you're in the US, but it's terrible if you're in another country that's pegged to the US dollar, because now all of your dollars are worth less. But so the reason why in the original use case, Bitcoin came out, tons of energy, yes, great sort of concept around the storing of genuine value, but useless when it came to smart contracts, right? Because it just used up too much energy and things like this. So But Jeff's theory and a bunch of other folks' theories is that if, that had not been an impediment back in the early days of Bitcoin, we would never have needed any of the other chains, right? So Ethereum, Solana, all of the other guys that were trying to figure out how to make the smart contract piece more efficient, would not have had to have bothered if that functionality had been available on Bitcoin, because the ultimate goal is the functionality of smart contract matched with the true deflationary economic power of Bitcoin, right? And I think things like RGB, Lightning, Liquid, so many people now trying to work on Bitcoin ordinals and bring that functionality back. So yes, you do have to buy into the fact that Bitcoin ultimately will be the sort of genuine true store of value. But if you do that, and there's many reasons why you should, I think, then it's almost inevitable that, and Jeff will say very controversially that every single other chain will eventually disappear and it will all only revert to Bitcoin, right? True or not, I don't know. But it's a very interesting concept to get your head around. And that is why I think there's so many Bitcoin maximalists who genuinely believe that over time, a single Bitcoin could be worth, crazy numbers in the millions of dollars, because ultimately it is going to replace the current currency reserves of the entire world, right? And there we go. It's only 9:50 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, but anyhow. Sorry, you muted again, Nico.
I don't know why it mutes.
I know I wrap it on for so long, you probably have to mute, but anyway.
No, I was at an event that there were so many Bitcoin maximalists, and some of them said they don't even believe in cryptocurrency. They think it's a scam, but they believe in Bitcoin. Do you agree with that? Like, aren't they similar?
I don't know what the difference between crypto and Bitcoin is then.
I know, and I was like,
arbitrarily produced
one but not the other. It's just like interesting. I don't think not everybody is as educated about it, and a lot of people are just following the hype. And haven't.
I will again. He did two things. The Price of Tomorrow as a book is really worth reading, and then the other one is there's a blog post called Signal to Noise. I'll try and find it. I don't know exactly where it is. I think it's Signal to Noise. Came out a couple of years ago, about 40 million readers, and it's really worth reading because even if he isn't right, the way that he articulates the potential of him being right is worth reading. And again, I kind of, I'm currently working on one video game actually. I mentioned Samson Mao already. He has a games company, and so we are trying to push forward with the world's first Bitcoin-backed. It's an MMORTS. So somebody mentioned Eve Frontiers. There's definitely components of this game. It's called Infinite Fleet, and it originally came out. It was Ethereum based, and it was one of the first games to actually issue security tokens. Right, so always on the cutting edge. But the reason why we've sort of been somewhat delayed in its launch is because we are retooling it to run on Bitcoin, primarily because of everything I've just said. Well, not primarily because of everything I've just said, but it definitely relates to it, right? So, I think this whole, are we at the point in time now in 2025 where if we could reset the clock, we wouldn't need the side chains? I don't know. I'm not technical enough to know that, right? But from a sort of philosophical and theoretical standpoint, I would buy into what Jeff says, right?
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. And if you can share those links afterwards, that would be really great.
I want to put them out. Yeah.
Awesome. And I'm just curious, because we talk about emerging tech a lot on this show. What are your thoughts about XR and AI it relates to gaming and Web3?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously XR has had a number of false starts. I think we're still waiting for the killer device. I mean, I've seen a couple. I wouldn't say that they're still yet killer devices. I think, for sort of more mainstream use cases, XR, particularly augmented reality rather than fully virtual, has tons of use cases. I can't say who it was, but seen a company working very hard on figuring out how to create, additional heads-up display AR stuff for Formula One race teams, things like this. So I think that stuff's going to be very interesting. Personally speaking, putting on a headset in order to go gaming for any longer than maybe 10-15 minutes, I still find it kind of tiring on the neck. Now on the other side though, I think AI is just an inevitable component of the future, and not only from things like making games more efficiently, but personalization, difficulty levels, how we market, just figuring out each player has a unique pattern that's, as they lead into that piece of the game where they're about to pay. Obviously we've done cohort analysis and tried to figure out what payment triggers there are for certain groups, but the ability to do that on a minority report level is going to be exciting and very scary at the same time. So yeah, there's no way that AI is not going to be a massive piece of every component of games moving forward. And again, to go back to the very beginning, I think as we figure out how that works, we will then see those, because obviously introducing things where you can increase your level of revenue in a game by, let's say you can double the revenue in your game. That is a significant amount of money, because obviously games are a format in which people are willing to spend. But as with all of the other things that we've looked at, as that then proliferates out into other more sort of consumer general products, I think it'll happen. I do think, there's a number of companies working on very large shared digital spaces, Metagravity being a great example. And I think, the whole idea of, do I need 100,000, 200,000 people in a single game or virtual reality game experience? I'm not sure. The added benefit of that tech is that it makes, online hosting way cheaper in general. But as I put on my augmented reality glasses, and I do need to exist in a single shared digital space with everybody in Vancouver around me, some of those technologies are going to also become really important. So yeah, I think it's a mix. And so I would say that I'm bullish on AR more than I am on pure VR. But, who knows? Who knows?
Yeah. I appreciate it. We have a lot of questions and comments. I'm just going to get to a few questions and wrap it up soon. So Julian says, it's a long message, so I'm going to just get the question. How do you think games will overcome the cost of transactions, making success more money-based?
Yeah, I think, looking at that, I don't think it has to be the case, right? I think there are ways in which the pure game design stalwarts, shall we say, can still have their day in the sun, right? I love pure game design, and to a certain degree, I wouldn't say I was one of the guys when free-to-play came out who was sort of opposed to it, but I do think it changed in some ways the pure nature of gaming. So, again, people have to make money in order to be able to make games. And so I think if the consumer is willing to spend 80, 90 bucks up front in order to buy a game of the caliber that they want to play, and then play it for, 100 hours or whatever it is, it's still a very, very cost-effective form of entertainment, right? So does that then mean, for example, when I finish playing the game, because it's on blockchain, I can sort of recreate a secondhand market like GameStop or Electronics Boutique or what have you, so that, at the time that I sell the game on, the original developer actually still takes a cut? Maybe that makes it cheaper for everybody. So I don't think the only application of chain is necessarily even within games. It's around the distribution, marketing, resale, skinning, modding, all of these kinds of things, right? So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question, but I don't necessarily think that we have to sort of fall into the trap that thinking Web3 has to be play to earn, right? I think there's many other formats which we can use. Yes. The benefits of the chain without it having to be play to earn. Now, I don't know what those are, and somebody who cracks it, that's going to be an amazing game to play, right? So hopefully there's some developers in the audience who are working on it.
Thank you so much for the great question and great answer. We're almost at the end of the show. I think, James, maybe you want to go to the comments after the show and respond to everyone, because that is a lot. And I'm so grateful for all the engagement. Just quickly, if you can just tell us what are your, beyond what you shared about XR and Web3 and what's coming up, what are your biggest predictions, if you can share within a minute, and what's next for you and your businesses?
Yeah, well, for me, it really is that intersection. I think owner champion really is kind of like it's like a keyword for me at the moment, whether or not that's games, whether or not it's music, whether it's real estate assets. And I also do see that there is, it's interesting, that question about kind of pure gameplay rather than the play to earn components. If we can figure out these pieces that kind of keep us human, music, travel, feet in the sand, playing games with each other, board games, You know, people gathering around a TV and actually playing games socially. Like when I first moved to Japan, I was with this family who used to play Bomberman all day. It was amazing, right? So it's that human connection piece. And I think, you know, whatever we do, we have to retain that. But I do think things like user-generated content and the ability to create communities of like-minded people and actually get rewarded for doing that through some of these new systems. You know, again, I'm relatively positive about the future here. So, you know, we'll see. We'll have to write another metaverse roadmap and see where we get to in 2040, I guess. You know, don't you think?
Sorry, I cut off. I was asking what's next for you and how people can support you.
Next for me, I'm going to go on my heavy metal truants charity cycle ride from London to the Donington Download Festival with my buddies in the heavy metal industry to raise money for kids' charities. So anybody wants to help me on that one, then please feel free, just any little donation. But I mean, seriously, I don't know. In terms of what's next for me, I always have a great day. I always get up in the morning and it's usually, you know, one thing after the other that just keeps me fascinated and excited to be in the industry, right? And always proud to be a games guy. So there we go.
Amazing. And you're expanding Greenstone and doing a lot of great work. Awesome. Thank you so much, James. This was such an insightful conversation. And I want to thank our amazing audience, Yemi, Ian, Julian, Justin, Natalia, Felipe, JK, Ian again, and Shadi, Fatima, Mark, Simon, and yeah, Jean. So grateful for all of you being live with us and a lot of other folks that might be watching the recording. I will be actually converting this to an article and we'll publish it tomorrow if you prefer reading the summary or keeping it for later or sharing it with your friends. You can also watch the recording through the same link. Again, we're very grateful for all of your engagement and your insights, James. And we'll be back next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll continue every Tuesday at 12 p.m. EST. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
See you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.